Good morning, everybody. Happy Tuesday to you, the 15th of September, 2020. And let's get down to it. BOYT Theater, history comes alive. The great philosopher Santayana once said, those who do not learn from history are doomed to repeat it. And one of the things that I find most fascinating about history is people do repeat the same mistakes over and over and over. Why don't people learn from their mistakes? Why do people repeat the same behaviors and make the same mistakes? Well, one thing is for sure, human nature is the one constant through history. Human nature remains the same. We tend to overestimate our abilities and underestimate our weaknesses. Therefore, when we look at things that people have done before, we make the judgment, oh, we know where they made the mistake, we can do it better. In the case of Napoleon, the emperor of self-proclaimed, self-anointed emperor of France in the 1800s. It's a very interesting case study in a little man who started out as a corporal in the French army and rapidly rose to the ranks of general because he had some skill at winning on the battlefield. And when he became a general, the feeling about the way that France was run, and he had some ideas about a better way of doing things, and he rose to a point where he was able to take over as general of the armies and appoint himself in Notre Dame Cathedral, that poor cathedral that suffered such extensive damage a couple of years ago, appoint himself the Emperor of France. Well, he wasn't content with France for French people. He wanted to expand the borders of France. And since he was of a military background, he made it a point to routinely invade countries and go to war and take over parts of Spain and put them under control, put his brother as the emperor of Spain. He did all kinds of things in his career because he believed wrongly that he could not be defeated. Little man, little body with a big ego syndrome, right? Think about that. Well, when the War of 1812 unfolded and Napoleon decided to invade Russia and move deep and hope to capture Moscow to force the capitulation of the Tsar there, Tsar Alexander. Of course, we know he made a fatal mistake because in marching into the 1,000+ miles to get to Moscow, his army undertook a slash and burn, and soldiers would end up doing all kinds of heinous deeds to the citizens of the lands that they moved through, taking their crops, taking their livestock, doing physical harm, heinous things like rape visited upon the women folk. It was a very terrible thing. But the one thing that Napoleon never considered in his quest was the same thing that King Charles XII never considered in his invasion of the early 1700s. Yes, Napoleon was not the first one to undertake a ill-fated invasion into Russia. King Charles XII of Sweden decided to invade Russia in the early 1700s, and it also became a disaster. He was defeated, tons of his army froze to death, the rest were taken prisoner. What tiny little remnant of his army was left, 500 or so people, they sought refuge under the protection of the Ottoman Empire as they attempted to reconstitute themselves, but they never did. He was another guy that had big ideas about his power, just like Napoleon did. Well, we know that the Tsar of Russia, Nicholas, never met Napoleon in Moscow. He never answered the requests, the messages, the word put out, I'd like to meet with you, we can have a peace treaty. Alexander just gave him the silent treatment. and even went so far as to light Moscow on fire so that there would be nothing left for Napoleon, and it was getting on fall and winter. Napoleon packed up all the loot that he could get, started his long journey back to France, had tons of women in tow, furs, gold, whatever they could loot, whatever was left or doesn't take out from Moscow or burned, was slowly marching its way back to Paris. And then you guessed it, old General Winter stepped in and froze untold numbers of Napoleon's troops. He had marched into Russia with over 500,000 troops, and by the time he had passed back his army, passing by the very citizens that he had trampled underfoot and stolen their provisions and destroyed, well, you can imagine any chance a peasant had to take a pot shot or to grab some retreating, weakened French soldiers who hadn't had anything to eat. Boy, they had great sport with them on the way back. Not to mention that the Cossacks, that's the Russians that like to come in on horseback and basically take a sword and cut your head off. They were a continuous raiding party on Napoleon's retreat and very effective. So every time Napoleon reached a river that wasn't frozen over, they had to build a bridge, and while troops were attempting to cross, the Russians set up cannons, destroy the bridges, lots of people died. By the time Napoleon broke off from his retreating army, he was such a, in my opinion, such a coward by that point that he had a fast sled, raced on ahead to Paris, and basically left his army with one or two revered generals, and they had to fight their way back with a rear guard action. They finally got back into Paris with less than 50,000 out of the original 500,000 men that had been on the expedition. It was a disaster. Next, Napoleon wrongly assumed that the powers that had defeated him in the field of Russia, the Prussians, started to gather some English elements that hated his guts, decided to not just let him retreat back to the borders of France and hide in Paris, but they decided to pursue him. And the Russians came rolling in, and the city of Paris surrendered. And we all know that Napoleon was sent out to the island of Elba, and he was put into isolation out there, which was quite humiliating for him. And then, lo and behold, miracle of miracles, while the continental forces that had opposed him were trying to figure out how to set up a better society on the continent of Europe, they were fighting skirmishes here and there with royalists and other people in France in 1815. While the ships guarding Napoleon, being captive on Elba, were off, he took an opportunity to escape with 1,000 loyalists. And you know what? After being defeated, the 100 days was on in March of 1815. He escaped. He landed in France and made his way back towards Paris, gathering people as he went. He once again believed himself invincible. He was an illegitimate ruler at this time, but there were still a lot of people that did not like the royalist system in France, and Napoleon was kind of a good bullshitter, and he was able to gather enough of a force that it took 100 days to bring him to bay. Thanks to the big defeat by Wellington, the Russians and the Prussians on the battlefield at Waterloo, Napoleon attempted to hide out. Eventually he was cornered and he was sent off to exile in the island of St. Helena, as further away as you could put somebody in the British Empire, where he died in 1822. What's significant is that there was 100 days, right, after that defeat. After that stunning defeat and collapse, having invaded Russia, yes, he was able to come back for that glorious 100 days before the final nail in the coffin was put in. That's the BOYT History Theater come alive today. Are there parallels to today's world? You tell me. Does history repeat itself? Oh, so many times, on so many different scales, when people have an overinflated opinion of themselves. And, well, you know what happens. Vive la France. Vive l'Empereur. Happy Tuesday, everybody. Hope you enjoyed this little foray into history, and thumbs up are appreciated.